Hello again and welcome to another episode of TIO Talks. My name's Warwick Powell and today I have a very special guest. I'm actually very excited to be catching up with an old friend who I hope is going to tell us some very fascinating stories about China's modernisation through the lenses of his own personal experiences. My guest today is Li Xiaoming. Xiaoming, for his sins, has been a corporate lawyer working in both the United States and of course in China, and has been at the forefront of corporate finance, major projects finance, and of course cross-border litigation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Warwick.
It's great to have you. Look, I remember a little while ago at dinner you told me about your own experiences during the Cultural Revolution, and it really pricked my interest in better understanding that period of China as a foundational experience actually for the modernisation journey that went after. Perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about that experience, your life experience in that time, and how on reflection what that experience tells us about the developmental journey of this country.
Well, thank you, Warwick. My story is relatively simple. I was born and grew up in Beijing, and went to primary school, high school, and then at the end of the high school, that was also at the tail end of the Cultural Revolution. As you know, during the Cultural Revolution, there was a movement of sending educated youth, 知青, to the countryside. When I finished high school, it was at the beginning of 1976. That was already at the end of Xiaxiang, going to the countryside. The big movement of Xiaxiang actually took place in the mid-1960s, particularly 66, 67, 68, 69, and tapered off towards the early 1970s. But I was there at the very end of the Xiaxiang, and at the time, we had more options. The students were given more options. And we could go to the military, and if we had siblings, and one sibling from one family can go and spare the rest of the family going to the countryside. And I was the eldest in my family. I thought, oh, going to the countryside should be good for me. And also I was a little bored in the city, and I felt going to the military, that should be for someone else. In fact, I was chosen to go to the military. I decided not to go because everyone else wanted to go. So I thought probably the opportunity would be better served for having someone else going to serve the military. At the time, the expectation was, if you go to the military and serve for 4 years, you are guaranteed to return home. Versus going to the countryside, and the guarantee is not there. And in fact, the reverse is true, because we were told once you go to the countryside, you should be prepared to stay in the countryside for the rest of your life. So that was the big risk. And in fact, when I decided to go to the countryside and go to remote area, because I went to Zhidan, which is in the northwest of the Yan'an region. In fact, Zhidan, named after Liu Zhidan, used to be called Bao'an. This is where the Long March first ended. And the Red Army spent 10 months in Zhidan. And then after that, the headquarters of the party and military went to Zaoyuan, went to where Yan'an is today. But in any event, I decided to go to Zhidan, and my parents were away. They were a little afraid that they would lose their son for the rest of their life.
Now, how long was the journey to get to Zhidan from Beijing?
Journey at a time was a little difficult. Today, it takes just 1 hour flight to Yan'an, or if you take the train, just a few hours. Back then, we will have to go by train from Beijing to Xi'an. From Xi'an by train to Tongchuan, or by bus from Xi'an to Tongchuan. From Tongchuan further by bus to Yan'an. Tongchuan is in the south, Xixian in the south. Tongchuan, Xi'an, Tongchuan, and Yan'an, and then took another bus all the way to Zhidan. So it took us altogether, because we did several things in between, it's actually two to 3 days to get there. And it was more or less the same when I left Zhidan 2 years later. Again, from Zhidan by bus to Yan'an, then by bus to Tongchuan, Tongchuan to Xi'an, from Xi'an train back to Beijing. So that also took me just about a day and a half, 2 days back then.
It was really going to a different world, wasn't it?
It was a different world. I think people like us, we had some exposure to the countryside because every year we would go to the countryside to help the peasants to harvest the crops. So we knew, but the experience was all in the countryside near Beijing. So we thought we knew until we went to Yan'an. It was a very different world. The poverty and the extremeness of the hard condition of the natural environment was such. So many of my cohorts who went to the countryside together felt, oh my gosh, this is really a different world. And many felt very sad for themselves. But I said, look, this is the country we thought we knew, but we better just spend the time to understand this country better. And for me, when I look at the local peasants, I felt like they are human being, I'm human being. If they can survive, I can survive too. Why should I be the person who have all the privileges, living in the city, and now thinking about these people? And after all, these people helped win the revolution and help establish the PRC.
Now, Chairman Mao actually had a phrase describing city kids going to the country.
Yes. 知识青年到农村去，大有作为, which means they have a big role to play into countryside. 广阔天地，大有作为, which means the immense landscape that is the playground for the youth to play their role. So, and we didn't quite understand what role we would play, but we knew back then, even before we went to the countryside, the high schools in Beijing taught 2 courses to prepare us to go to the countryside. Number 1, to learn how to tell the weather. Number 2, how to fix farming machinery. And just to know the basics of farming machinery, because at the time, cities around the country started to send tractors and other farming machines to the countryside. But the countryside didn't have enough engineers or people who understand how the machinery would work, either to operate or to fix them. So we were in high school were taught how the basic farming machinery was going to operate and how we could do to fix them, and also tell the weather, whether or not it's going to rain, it's going to snow, it's going to have other natural disasters, what have you. So to prepare us, so we'll be better prepared and having our experience in the countryside.
Now, did you have to fix tractors when you were there?
Oh, I didn't, because by then there were, I think, about 10 years ahead of me, educated youths who had been there. They had taught the local folks how to run the machine, how to fix the machine, and also by then there were factories, small factories being set up here and there to fix the machineries.
One of the interesting things that I noticed about that period, and you mentioned this when we caught up before, is that one of the effects of educated city kids going to the countryside was actually a legacy of improved literacy and numeracy in the countryside. And I've seen data which shows that too, and it seems that that's an underappreciated aspect of that period.
Absolutely, and today people talk about 高考, talk about Gaokao today compared to Gaokao in the 1977, the first Gaokao after the Cultural Revolution, the entrance exam to the college. People were saying back then there were so many country kids from the countryside who were able to pass the exams and went to college. And what was left unsaid was the reason that they were able to complete exam and do well in exam was because the education they got. Back then, I think the educated youth, people like us, we were there, and one of the first jobs we were given to fill all the teaching positions and to establish new schools for the countryside so that the kids could learn how to read and write. And when I came back from the countryside, recently I read the statistics from National Archives. During the 10-year period from 1969 to 1979, the literacy rate in the countryside, in the country as a whole, shot up substantially. Then 10 years after that, from 79 to 89, the literacy rate actually went down. That's because we had left. The school's teaching positions, even though some of the kids stayed on, they had been taught by us, stayed on as teachers, there's still a lot of vacancies of the schools. I'll give you one example. One of the IE that we had over the past few years, she is now in the early 50s. She's illiterate. I was shocked, and I said, how come today you have a 51, 52 years old from remote countryside, came to Beijing, couldn't read and write? That's because she told me at the time schools were shut down, all the kids, all the city kids had left. So we had no one to teach us how to read and write. And our parents say, hey, now is different world, different paradigm, and you should go to the fields to work instead of going to school. But the other aspect, according to the National Archive, was that because we spent, the educated youth spent about 10 years teaching the kids in the countryside. So when the country started doing reform, starting from 1979, a lot of the country kids went to the city to seek employment. These were the kids who knew how to read and write. So they immediately were able to function as capable workers because they could read, they could write, they could understand the instructions given to them by the new factories being set up along the coastal cities. So when I read the statistics from the National Archives, and I said, oh, the Xiaxiang and the Cultural Revolution is so hard to describe the movement in one single narrative. It has a multi-dimensional aspect to it. I think some of which today is only beginning to be understood fully, to appreciate what effects the revolution really had on the country. I wouldn't give a generalization about how my view about the Cultural Revolution and also the countryside experience. What I want to say is it's not advisable to say it's good or bad. You have to understand from different angle, from different aspect, to have a fuller picture of what actually happened during that 10-year period of time.
Yeah, I think with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that it had many, perhaps at the time, unintended effects, but actually quite significant implications, particularly, as you say, in terms of literacy, numeracy, the ability then for people to get into the workforce, to drive that first phase of industrialization, you know, that period of the 1980s. Without literacy and numeracy, it would be almost impossible to imagine industrialization beginning.
Yes, and also from my personal point of view, I felt like I was not smarter than the country kids. I was not working harder than the country kids. Why is it I could read and write? I could have a different life than they did. And I felt felt like it was a duty bound, it's the obligation to share whatever I had got. Not because of my personal attributes, not because I worked harder, just because where I was. And to share that part with the folks who never had this opportunity. And I felt that's something, for me, is the right thing to do. To spend the time and talking about the risk of going to the countryside. At the time, as you know, in China, they have a hukou system, right? So the residence record. Before I went to the countryside, I had to cancel my Beijing hukou, my Beijing residency record. I have to go to the Public Security Bureau and say, I'm not going in the countryside, I'm not coming back. And that was kind of a scary part of it, but I was too young to fully appreciate the risk. But I said, look, what happened, happened. So it's my turn, I should do whatever there is for me to do.
Now from there, you did come back to the city, of course, and then developed a career in international law, focused very much on major projects, interacting with significant project financing, not only in China, but also in the developing world. And I'm interested to understand how perhaps some of those lessons that you learned and reflected upon ultimately guided the way that you engage with the law in the context of economic development, and how that shaped your approach to problem solving and mobilizing your intellectual resources in the aid of these sorts of projects.
I've been in practice of law for 35 years. There are many aspects that I can start talking about my personal experience, but I'll just tell one thing about Belt and Road and Chinese companies going abroad, which I think, as you know, BRI started 12 years ago. But even before that, Chinese companies started going abroad, and there was a need to expand the footprint of Chinese companies, not only to have new market, but also to have different markets recognize the Chinese technology, and also have the Chinese technology and experience to be battle tested outside of China to win the trust of foreign countries. So I started doing a lot of going abroad, financing Chinese companies going abroad, starting from 2005, when I joined Whiting Case as their head of China practice. At the time, many of major clients are Chinese financial institutions. So they were financing the going outbound of Chinese companies, be it telecom technology, infrastructure projects, all natural resources. So one of the things that I started to notice was that there was a lot of negativities of reporting the Chinese initiatives in the Western press. And because many of the projects that we were doing were in the countries which were viewed by the West as hostile regimes. I once asked the Chinese, we were doing oil and gas project for major Chinese oil companies. I asked the Chinese delegation, I said, why are we doing the project in this particular country, which seemed to be portrayed as very hostile to the West, hostile to liberal democracy, hostile to its neighboring countries.
And high risk, I guess.
High risk too. And the head of delegation told me, saying, look, Mr. Li, And the country is 50% dependent on import of foreign oil. The low-hanging fruits, the richest projects, were in the hands of the West, were in the hands of Western-controlled companies. We had to do what we have to do to make sure that we have enough supply of natural resources to sustain the development of Chinese economy. And your job is to make sure that we don't run into a risk that is contrary not only to China, but also to the country that is the supply of our natural resources. So I started to realize that was the big background against which Chinese companies are going abroad. It was a relatively hostile environment, unfriendly. Unfriendly not only because the Western countries were hostile to the Chinese initiative, but also many of the elites of those countries, they have been educated in the West too. They also had suspicion about the Chinese intention, about the way we were doing things. They were not naturally friendly to us. They were not naturally cooperative with whatever we had to do. So they were questioning about not only our documents, our intention, but also just the way we were handling things. Obviously, on the Chinese side, we had a long way to go to learn how to deal with, not only with the advanced Western countries, but also with the so-called unfriendly regimes. So it's difficult in many dimensions. So that was the thing that I started to learn, that we used to have to cope whatever there is in front of us, using the best we have, and also I think to make sure that everyone understood the real objective of the Chinese company. As someone else was asking me, why is it so attractive for you to be a lawyer for 35 years? And I said, first of all, I don't have enough imagination to do something else. I don't have the courage or the wherewithal to do something different. But one thing that does attract me as being a lawyer is that the lawyer fundamentally, at the end of the day, is an art of persuasion. Because you sign a contract, you have to have meeting of the minds. The meeting of the minds has to be achieved through persuasion. You persuade not only your opponent, your counterparty, you have to persuade yourself. Otherwise, the enforceability of the contract will be dubious. It could be called duress, it could be called a lack of understanding. At the end of the day, the enforceability of the contract will be called into question. So being in a position to persuade both parties to a contract is something that is fascinating because it requires constant learning. And also it requires a level of humility. You have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of others to understand where they come from and to make sure that their interest is also being taken care of before your interest is carved in stone.
One of the interesting parts about Chinese firms going abroad, particularly into these very difficult markets, hostile environments, is the way in which risk was thought about from the finance point of view. So the Western narrative often says things like Chinese finance has engaged in exceptionally high-risk project lending. It has created this debt diplomacy narrative. And yet my understanding is that, in fact, there have been some very innovative approaches of dealing with this question of risk and counterparty risk, and how Chinese finance made projects possible that did actually take into account these challenges.
Bottom line, I think Chinese companies and Chinese financial institutions often take a higher risk than what is being reported. I'll give you one example. If you do a project finance, the project finance by definition is to use the cash flow of the project to service the debt. In order for that to happen, the lenders will have to be in control of the assets, in control of the operation, in control of the completion risk, and incomplete of technology transfer, human resources, what have you. But very often, by the nature of law, for a institution or a company from China, it's very, very hard to take control of all these aspects in an environment that is hostile to foreign interest, suspicious of Chinese intention, and very often they have domestic laws prohibiting Chinese companies or financial institutions to take control of the assets, the operation of the project. This is also true not only in project finance, but also in export credit finance too. So what's it going to do? So we cannot have control of the assets. So obviously the next thing you want to do is you have to ask someone else to give you a guarantee. The foreign host government will never give you a guarantee, or seldom do. Because for two things. Number one is a sovereign. They don't feel like they should use the sovereign power to guarantee a commercial project. Number two, there are various international treaties and organizations and requirements which put a ceiling as to how much a sovereign country can guarantee a foreign debt. So even if that sovereign government is willing to give a guarantee, by law, that guarantee may be dubious because of international agreements and treaties, what have you. So very often, at the end of the day, if the Chinese companies still want to do the project, banks still want to lend, the banks feel like they are taking the risk, because if the project goes sour, the bank's debt will not be paid back. So the banks cannot ask the foreign sovereign government to help, cannot ask the foreign corporate company to help, because either the corporate entity is unwilling or is unable. So very often the Chinese bank come back to the parents of the Chinese companies, saying, "Look, I'm doing a loan in a foreign country. The beneficiary is one of your subsidiaries, because the subsidiary is either doing a project or is selling equipment to that foreign country. So you as a group, you are the head of the group, you are the ultimate beneficiary. You should give us a guarantee." So very often the Chinese banks circle back to the parent of the Chinese companies back in China to get a guarantee for the loan the Chinese bank was lending to a foreign country. So in fact, I was asked by the Chinese banks regulators, saying, "Mr. Li, what do you think of the risk Chinese banks and companies going abroad?" I said there are many, but one thing that is not understood well enough was the internalization of foreign risk back into China. Even though you do a lot of projects overseas, the ultimate risk remains in China. So this is something I feel like is not fully understood, is never fully discussed. But that's what's been going on for quite some time. I think it's still going on today.
So Xiaoming, what this really leads me to think about is this question of debt trap. Because what you've described is a debt structure and a series of relationships that strongly suggests that this notion of debt trap is a very misleading one.
I think it's very misleading from my personal experience, and also how many of the projects are actually structured, particularly for the debt service, debt repayment. For example, when a Chinese bank lends to a project in an overseas country, sponsored by a Chinese EPC or a project developer, and obviously let's say a train project or a mining project or an oil and gas project, and very often the loan will come from a Chinese bank lending to the project. From the bank's point of view, they obviously want to control the risk. They control risk, either by controlling the operation of the project on the ground, or the construction, the operation, and also the human resources and what goes into the project. But very often, it's very hard. And Chinese banks, in all my years, Chinese bank has never, in my personal view, has never enforced their loan against the local assets or against the local company, because they know, even by enforcement, even if by law they have every right to enforce against the assets or against the project or against whatever cash flow there is from the project, it's going to be futile. You cannot get the cash back. You cannot get the project back because the project is located outside of China. You don't have any other means to force that company to perform. So at the end of the day, the bank said, we have to cover our risk too. The only available option is go back to the parent of the Chinese project company saying, look, we are financing a project for the subsidiary of yours. And you as a group is a beneficiary of our loan in some way, apart from the Chinese host, the foreign host country and host location. So you have to help us too. So they go back to the parent company saying, look, this is our exposure. We want some kind of a guarantee from you. If the project goes sour, you have to come up with something to make us full, to make us so that we will be in a position to recoup some, if not all, the loans we have lent to the project located outside of China. Many of the projects are structured in this way. Many. So much so, there is a lot of back and forth between the Chinese bank, the financial institutions, or the institution lending money to the project, with their company, with the parent company, back in Beijing or in Shanghai. In fact, there's more discussion back home than very often is the discussion about the loan repayment overseas. This is what happened, and this happens a lot more than people realize. And so much so, I think there was a concern that from the Chinese banking regulatory authorities saying the risk, even though the project is overseas, the risk is being internalized. China as a whole, either financial institutions or the government, is taking a bigger risk than what is fully being understood outside of China. So that trap, to me, I think, who is trapping whom? And first of all, we have no intention to trap anyone. Secondly, when the loan goes back, the trap comes back to the Chinese parent company. So the risk, the overseas risk, being internalized as being a China risk.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, Xiaoming. Look, thanks very much for coming onto the program today and sharing with us not only your personal journey, but your personal insights as a result of your work as a global lawyer working in the area of major project finance. I hope that it opens people's eyes to some of the realities of China's own developmental experience, as well as China's contribution to the development of the Global South.